Okay, hello guys. We're going to go through some notes that link up with Chapter 6. And Chapter 6 talks about the period just as the Revolutionary War is beginning, and talks much about how the war was fought, advantages, disadvantages of the war that each side had. And it ends with how the colonies, which become states after declaring independence, have become now the United States, and creating then our Constitution that we have today. So what that means is you are going to see a number of funny memes that I enjoy. These happen to be George Washington memes. And I just think a lot of memes that deal with history, U.S. history, are pretty hilarious in general. But you'll notice that I have a few George Washington memes tied in here. And these notes here are just kind of an overview of Chapter 6. Of course, you want to read it. I also am posting a direct link, an active link, in the same folder, the Chapter 6 notes folder, for you to go and pause me. Which I strongly encourage you to do. You will want to pause me, and you will want to watch the videos that I have attached inside of this Google Slide note presentation. Okay, please watch them. They will be good for you, and they will help put some color and some action onto these Google Slide notes for you. Okay, so with that, let's get started. Oh, here we go. Here are a few of those memes that I was talking about. These are absolutely hilarious. George Washington standing there, naming his cannon George. That's very, very funny. And George talking to the redcoat reminds me of an oppressive government. These are absolutely just hilarious. And here's another one. This is one of my favorites. As you know, Betsy Ross was responsible for sewing the flag and whatnot. Looks like George wants a tank instead. Too cute. Okay. You will see, of course, plenty of historical memes. These are some of my favorite ones dealing with George Washington. And if you're familiar with the movie Jaws, some of you might be too young to know what the movie Jaws is. A movie about a shark in the late 1970s that came out. This is the play on the movie Jaws. Hilarious. Okay, so those of you who are hoping to get a full dose of the American Revolution in a number of slides, I apologize. That's not going to happen. We are looking at the American Revolution here in one slide. So everyone, welcome to APUSH. Remember I said a while back that we don't really necessarily look at the war itself, key battles and strategy and all that stuff and dates. But we do take a look at causes and effects. And I'll stress that again. So what we have here is the American Revolution in one handy dandy slide. And we have another here, very hilarious George Washington meme. Anyway, just to catch you up to speed, what we're going to do here is we're going to basically start with the Battle of Saratoga. Because the Battle of Saratoga was a key battle. And what you need to understand here is that prior to the Battle of Saratoga, which was, by the way, won by the Patriots, is that the British had been experiencing most of the success during the war, dating back to, well, really Lexington and Concord, but generally overall, including the win in the Battle of Long Island off of New York City. In fact, in that battle, the British were able to push back the Patriots, the Continental Army, all the way back into Pennsylvania. So that was a key win for the British in 1777, 1778, and 9, and in that time period. And the other thing you want to know, too, is that yes, France would eventually end up becoming an ally with the colonists. But up until this time, up until the Battle of Saratoga, the French really weren't on board with helping the colonists really at all. They over time, and it took the victory at Saratoga by the colonists to persuade France to enter the war. And France really would be, kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was that kind of mentality, meaning that, of course, the French and the British never got along. Recall they fought the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, just 10 years prior, right? That war had just ended 10 years before this, or so, 10 or 12 years, 1763. And the French entered the war after the colonists' victory at Saratoga. So it took a little convincing on the colonists' part. That was in 1781, and the French really wanted to get some revenge on the British for having defeated them in the 7 Years' War, losing Quebec, losing Canada, and much of their territory, and much of their colonies around the world as well. So the French looked at this as an opportunity to not just help the colonists, but also, give a little payback to the British in 1781. So the French offer troops, they offer supplies, they offer gunpowder, ammunition, all of those things that are needed to help fight a war and defeat Great Britain in the process. Prior to that, though, the war, like I said, was not going very well for the colonists, including what was going on at Valley Forge in 1777. George Washington and his troops, you kind of see the meme here to the right, which is a play on what was going on at Valley Forge. Valley Forge was essentially a disaster. Washington and his army was growing very sick. There was very poor food supplies, cold weather, fatigue. They had just been fighting a number of battles, and things were just not going very well. But thank goodness for the Baron von Steuben, who was sent and came up with his own plan. He actually prepared the troops. He raised the readiness of the American army. He was a Prussian, or another word for German, military officer. He was really kind of a handful of aristocrats, basically, kind of a Republican-minded aristocrat who helped join the American cause. And what he did is he appointed kind of an inspector general to the Continental Army, and he implemented a really strict drill regimen and drill system that encouraged the officers to become more professional. And thanks to him, he kind of saved the day. The smaller army that was the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge in 1778. They were a much tougher, they were a much more well-organized, disciplined fighting force. And the type of warfare that was being fought, particularly in the Carolinas, was known as guerrilla warfare. It's a term that you may not be familiar with unless you're into military strategy and things like that. But guerrilla warfare was a type of warfare that is used by armies, by militaries, against larger, less mobile militaries and armies. And it consists of things like ambushes and hit-and-run tactics, things like that. And it's used really to string out the duration of a war, where militaries kind of using guerrilla warfare tactics, they basically fight a war in terms of not to lose the war, right? So they try and wear down their opponent because their opponent has distinct advantages against them. This kind of warfare was used specifically in North and South Carolina. And we will come across this kind of warfare again because during the Vietnam War that we fought in the 1960s and into the 1970s, the North Vietnamese army would implement, and the Viet Cong would implement guerrilla warfare tactics and strategies against us, against the United States. So this is something that we will come back to again once we get to the 1960s. Long story short, eventually by 1781, the British would surrender at Yorktown, which was another key battle. The colonists would defeat the British army at Yorktown, and that really signified the end to the war. Okay, There were some advantages and disadvantages that both sides had, and you want to read about those in Chapter 6. And the next slide here is actually a scene, if you will, an act from the musical Hamilton, which is a fantastic musical. So what I would encourage you to do right now is pause me, stop me, and go to the live Google Slide link that I have attached in the Chapter 6 folder and watch this video. It is like I said, a scene that is entitled Yorktown from the musical Hamilton. All right, and if you're familiar with this, you've seen Hamilton, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So pause me, and I will be back here in a moment. Okay, I'm back. Thanks for starting me up again. Hopefully you were able to watch that video from the musical Hamilton. I think it's just a fantastic musical. It's great to watch. I mentioned before you paused me that both sides had advantages and disadvantages, and one of the questions that people were asking at the beginning of this war, of course, is how in the world were the colonists, these 13 colonies, with kind of a ragtag army, with the Continental Army, going to defeat the largest empire in the world. And really one thing, and this is one of the things I don't have on here, is that despite the 3 bullets on here, that the advantages that the colonists possess is that the British ministry, the British Parliament, did admit that they made a number of military blunders within their military leadership over the course of the war. But historians, even though they acknowledge many British mistakes, they also attribute the Patriots' victory to these 3 broad advantages. One, of course, we had French aid, right? The French alliance that was created after the Battle of Saratoga was key, with French ammunition and gunpowder and supplies and especially troops. So the French played a key role in the Patriot victory over the British. A second thing that they point to is, of course, the leadership skills of General Washington, of George Washington. And he implemented strategies I mentioned on the previous slide before you pause me, is that the colonists fought largely a defensive war. And that goes along with that guerrilla warfare type of military strategy. Those techniques, guerrilla warfare techniques, are used to fight a defensive war, meaning, again, fighting not to lose. Okay, and the hope is that by using a defensive type of strategy, Washington was hoping that would minimize the casualties and try to keep morale up for as long as possible throughout the course of the war. And like I said earlier, the morale was very low up to and through Valley Forge. But after some key victories, namely Saratoga, and then eventually Yorktown, morale greatly improved. And then, of course, the third main advantage was us, the American people. 1/3 of all white colonists were these zealous or super patriots. And another key advantage that we had and what made the war successful is that tens of thousands of these zealous patriots accepted continental bills, the money, the currency that was being used in payment for supplies, and thousands of soldiers in the Continental Army accepted and used the Continental bill as pay. So even as the currency literally was depreciating in their pocket, it was, in other words, the inflation was very high. It meant that every paper dollar bill that was held usually for longer than a week was losing value. still really important, though the role of the continental currency, the continental bill, helped finance the war in many ways. All right, so these are your three kind of main advantages that the Patriots had over the British. Okay, so what started to happen then during the course of the war, even as soon as independence was declared, the idea of the colony kind of ceased to exist, and the Americans started to reject even more so any kind of royal authority, and they started to establish more republican governments. So what that means is that most states now, were known as the 13 states, started to set up their own state constitutions. In fact, within a matter of months of declaring independence, you had states like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania had all ratified some new state constitution. And even colonies like Rhode Island and Connecticut had revised their colonial charter to basically delete any reference to a monarch or a king. So if you recall, the Declaration of Independence stated and talked about the idea of popular sovereignty, that government derives their just powers from the consent of the governed. So what states started to do was set up their own constitutions, like I said, and the most democratic, like the one that was way out there more than anyone else, was the Constitution that Pennsylvania had drawn up. The Constitution of Pennsylvania was like I said, was really out there compared to the other ones. We wouldn't consider it way out there today, but for 1776, 7, and 8, we really would. It created a unicameral legislature. If you remember your civics, perhaps from 9th grade, unicameral means that it consisted of a legislature that consisted of one house or one chamber with complete power. Pennsylvania Constitution set up a government that would have no governor, no executive, and no governor to exercise any veto power. It also set up mandates to create a system of elementary school education, and it would protect citizens from going to prison if they were in debt. So these were things that the other states, you didn't find in other state constitutions. So Philadelphia was really, really, really out there and leading the way in terms of democratic constitution, so much so that it alarmed many of the other colonial leaders. For example, big surprise, John Adams, right, from Massachusetts. Adams was very outspoken about many different things. And John Adams actually denounced the idea of a unicameral legislature. He was quoted as saying, "It is so democratical that it must produce confusion and every evil work." So he was very much against the idea of a one-house legislature. And he, along with some of the other Patriot leaders, wanted to restrict office holding to what he said were men of learning, leisure, and easy circumstances, and warned basically that a one-house legislature would become oppressive under majority rule. So what he basically suggested doing was, and we'll see this later on when our own U.S. Constitution is created, what he suggested was legislatures that consisted of multiple houses. In other words, a two-house legislature, and also multiple branches of government, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch with specific functions. And he also, like I said, liked to see the states, including his own Massachusetts, create a legislature that would be a two-house legislature, an upper house and a lower house. The upper house could be called the Senate, which is, of course, what we have today, and the lower house would be known as the House of Representatives. And so that would be more of a kind of a mixed kind of government. And he would also like to have seen, he talked about a governor of each state having been elected, and the governor then possessing veto power, which would check the power of the legislature. That way the legislature wouldn't be able to make any law they wanted to. And he also wanted to see a judicial branch where the judges were appointed by the executive. They would not be elected by the people. So these were things that Adams came out and talked about and was a proponent of, including many other patriot leaders. Now, many of the colonies that became states had still property qualifications for voting, because many of these elite patriot leaders, like your Adams and whatnot, believed that the main qualification in order to vote was you had to own property. And for example, you had New York's Constitution, property qualifications excluded about 20% of white men from serving in the New York legislature because they had no property. They didn't own any property. In South Carolina, it was the worst. Elite planters used these property rules in South Carolina to disqualify about 90% of white men from holding office. It also required candidates for governor to be completely debt-free, and you had to own property in excess of $700,000 in today's dollars in property. So some of these states had very strict property qualifications. All right, and even though they were very strict, the bottom line is once the colonies became states and created their own state constitutions, these people who served in government, like John Adams and whatnot, and even regular folks like you and me, had much more power and say in their government than they did before. All right, and that includes, of course, voting, the right to vote, or the franchise, where they gained franchisement. All right, when we talk about that, we're talking about voting. So who ended up losing the war? Well, the main losers of the war, of course, were the Loyalists. Right? You can recall the Loyalists were those people who were very hesitant and were against independence. The Loyalists basically had much of their property lost or taken from them or seized, and it was redistributed to needy Americans. Most officials were unwilling to go that far, but that did happen in some of the states. When a state government did seize Loyalist property, it was usually auctioned off to the highest bidder. But only rarely did small-scale farmers benefit from that. Usually what happened, and this was more of a social change, is that in many of the cities, patriot merchants replaced Loyalists at the top of the economic food chain, for lack of a better word. And they were the ones who largely took over the economy. Other losers during the war, you had women by and large as well, and you had women who were very outspoken against the elites, the white male elite, the patriot class, if you will, who were for independence. Women like Abigail Adams speaking out, who was very much against the tradition and customs and the traditional role of women in society. She was very outspoken with her husband John, telling him to remember the ladies. A famous document or a famous letter that she had written him in his back and forth travels to the Continental Congresses that were meeting at the time, before the Revolution. And they, despite their being outspoken against the male part of society at the time, a lot of it fell on deaf ears, and the traditional and customary roles of women continued to stay in place, and those stereotypes stayed in place long after the Revolution was over. And then, big surprise, unfortunately, Native Americans and also slaves were also losers as a result of this war. American Indians, many of them fought on the side of the British, and they also had much of their land stripped from them, and claims to their land were lost. And as far as slaves go, the Revolution was fought to protect property rights. So any sentiment favoring slave emancipation or freedom of the slaves was very, very much objected. The British had a policy in place where slaves in the colonies, if they fought on behalf of the British, if they fought on the British side, they would be promised land and their freedom. But slaveholders, particularly in the South, used these revolutionary principles to defend their right to human property, and they viewed slaves as human property. So they were not ready to emancipate or grant freedom to any slaves whatsoever after the war was over. And the issue of slavery would come up, of course, when we were drafting our own U.S. Constitution. So the liberties that were coveted and possessed by ordinary white Americans bore really hard on the interests of Native Americans and slaves during this time. During the course of the war, early on, once the colonies became states, they had to draw up their own, or they drew for the first time their first federal constitution, their own federal government. And the name of that government was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation essentially were a complete disaster. Okay? And the reason why they were a disaster is once independence was declared, the states envisioned a central government with very, very limited powers, right? And that should make sense. They were breaking away from a strong central government in the British Parliament and a king, and they were very, very, very fearful of granting any more power necessary to a central government than what was needed. So they came up with the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles did not do a good job at all. Think of the Articles of Confederation as basically the states agreeing to be friends. The states were friends, on the same side. They were on the same team during the war, but they were each basically fighting for themselves in the end. Okay? Yes, they were fighting for their own independence, right? But that's basically what the Articles were like, what the central government was like. So the Articles were approved by the Continental Congress, you can see in November of 77, and this was the central government that would be in place for about 10 years. It was a very loose union. Each state was very free, very independent of each other. You can see I have in quotes, it was an association of equals. So the problems were many. There were many, many, many more problems with the Articles than there were advantages or good things that came out of them. First of all, under the Articles, each state got a vote. Okay, and it doesn't matter what size the state was. So a big state like Virginia or Georgia or whatever had the same vote as a Massachusetts or Rhode Island would. Okay, so the weight of the vote was the same. And what made the Articles what made it really difficult as a central government is that all the important laws that were required to be passed, you needed to have 9 of the 13 states to okay it, or to approve it. And changing the Articles was even more difficult because it required unanimity. All 13 states had to approve any change to the Articles of Confederation. Other problems with the Articles included they purposely set up no chief executive, so there was basically no executive branch. In other words, there was no president under the Articles during the time of the war. There was no judicial branch, so they couldn't solve legal issues. And probably most importantly is that the Articles did not allow for the central government to tax the states or the people. So Congress, the central government, there was only a legislative branch. They really had no way to raise revenue. So they had to rely on the states largely to help pay for the war. That, of course, would change later on. But this was a real problem, not being able to tax the states or the people. And if you don't know anything about taxes, right, as much as Americans complain about their taxes, and boy, are we a country that do not like paying taxes. We have a long history, right, of not paying taxes. tax revenue, when we're taxed, our income tax and all different kinds of tax goes towards the government to help pay for the services that we use. So if you like driving on highways, if you like having your highways with no potholes or cracks in them, that tax money that the government collects is used to help fix those highways. So that's sometimes also used to help fight wars. And the legislative branch in 1777 that was created under the Articles did not have the power to raise tax revenue. And that would become a problem later on. Now, there were some good things, although there were very few, that came out of the Articles. And one of those positives, we'll call them, that came out of the Articles were these 3 land ordinances. And what we're talking about here primarily is after the war was over in 1783, many of these new acquired territories wanted to eventually become states, right? So more and more people were moving there. They would, because there's no more proclamation line in 1763 preventing people from moving west. So territories, for example, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, the northwestern part of Minnesota, for example, as more and more people would move there and the population would increase, then these territories would eventually want to apply for statehood. And in large part, these 3 land ordinances made that possible. So they had something to do with the geography of the United States and how it looks today. The Land Ordinance of 1784 basically spelled out how a territory can become a state as their population grew, basically listed the criteria that a territory had to follow in order to become a state. The Land Ordinance of 1785 basically created the grid system of surveying land. If you've ever been on an airplane, right, and you're flying and you look out, especially when you fly out and you look over the land in the midwestern part of the United States, you see a grid system. Everything is in rectangles. All the land is in rectangles and squares. There's a reason for that. Much of that stems from the Land Ordinance of 1785, where the land would be parceled out and it would be put in a grid, a rectangular grid, and the land was divided up that way. And then, of course, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 carved out these new territories, Ohio, Indiana, northwestern part of Minnesota, the Arrowhead region, and it would prohibit slavery forever. And the money that was gathered from selling this land would go to the funding of schools, which was really important at the time. Congress could appoint a governor, an executive, to head up these territories and newfound states eventually. Judges would run the territory. And when the population was big enough, the magic number was 60,000, they could write their own constitution, and they could join, and they could apply for statehood. So there weren't many positives that came out of the Articles, but if you're ever confronted with a question, a prompt talking about the Articles, what were some of the positives? Here you go. Here's one. You can talk about the land ordinances that were created under the Articles of Confederation. All right. And in your book, notice here I wrote see page 203. These 2 grids, these 2 little maps are in your book. You look at the one on the right here. That was the way that farms and land was divvied up prior to the Articles. Notice that this was the land ordinance, or I should say before the land ordinance in 1785. You look there, there aren't many flat-out rectangles or squares there, right? This is kind of, geometry 101. There aren't many rectangles there. But after the Land Ordinance of 1785, you can see that in Muskingum County, Ohio, almost every shape here is very geometrically in the shape of a rectangle or a square. Okay, and this is what I'm talking about. When you're flying, you look out over the window, look out the window over the Midwest. This is what you see, all these rectangular patterns. That stems back to 1785 and the Land Ordinance that was created, that was passed. So do take a look at page 203. Okay, you can pause me here. I want you to pause me here. I also posted a video in the folder about an event known as Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion would be a violent rebellion that would take place led by the farmer Daniel Shays. And what's important about Shays' Rebellion is that it would prove and it would show just how ineffective the Articles of Confederation really were. Okay, so the video that I posted there, the instructor there that's leading the video does a great job of explaining the causes and effects of Shays' Rebellion. So you do need to watch this. It is good for you. You do need to know what this event is. So pause me now and watch Shays' Rebellion, and then when you come back, we'll finish up. Okay, thanks for pausing me. Thanks for watching that video. This brings us to, you notice then in Shays' Rebellion, the end of the video there, he talks about how, there was a need for a stronger central government. Many of the patriots or the states believe that something like Shays' Rebellion shouldn't be allowed to happen again. And people started to realize that the Articles weren't as strong as they should be. So what the states did is they sent representatives to Philadelphia again in the summer of 1787. Every state did but Rhode Island. And when they met there, the original plan was to just basically modify and change the Articles of Confederation. But what the delegates soon realized is that that simply wasn't going to be enough, and that there were actually a number of issues that they had to deal with. Issue number one, they weren't there for a week or two, and they realized we have to settle the issue surrounding representation. And going into the Philadelphia Convention, there were two plans that were put forth on how to deal with the issue of representation in Congress. One was put forth by the large states. It was known as the Virginia Plan. And that plan basically called for representation in Congress to be based on the population of the state. So, of course, the larger the state, the more people you had, the more representatives you would have in Congress. That's what they argued for. The other plan put forth was supported by the smaller states, known as the New Jersey Plan. And that plan basically said, no, hold on, right? That's not fair, they said. It should be equal across the board. So they proposed a solution where there were two. Every state should have a number of two, for example, representatives. Well, in the end, there was a meshing of both plans, and it was known as the Great Compromise. And it called for a bicameral, there's that word again, bicameral legislature, a Congress that would consist of two chambers, a lower house, which is our House of Representatives, and an upper house, an upper chamber, which is the United States Senate. And every state government has a bicameral, well, I shouldn't say that, almost every state government has a bicameral legislature. I believe the only one that doesn't is, I think, Nebraska, but I'm not sure. But anyway, that's how they settled the issue of representation, where the House of Representatives, based on population, and then you have the U.S. Senate, which of course is based on, which is equal, right? There are two senators from every state that serve in the U.S. Senate. The other issue, another issue that the leaders had to wrestle with was what to do about slavery. Now, it might have been a good thing to deal with the slave issue right here and now in 1787, and they easily could have said, you know what, slaves are free, no more slaves, the war has been over, they fought for, in many cases on the side of the patriots, and we don't want to have to deal with the issue of slavery any longer. They could have done that, but they didn't do that. And it may, and probably did, historians have argued, come back to bite them in the end. What they did with the issue of slavery is, because one house was based on population, the northern states argued, well, the southern states are going to have many, many, many more representatives in Congress because they have more slaves there. And what they had to do was come up with some sort of compromise. So what they did is they took the population of every state and they multiplied that by 3/5, and that would be the number of representatives in Congress. It was known as the 3/5 compromise. In other words, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. And what that did is, even though it gave the southern states a little more of an advantage in Congress, it wasn't enough to cause that big of an issue at the time. But over time, this was going to become a very major issue. So that's how they handled the slavery issue. It was known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And then the last of the major compromises or issues they had to deal with was how to elect a president. And they, at the time, many of these leaders believed that the significance and importance of electing a president should not be left up to ordinary people like you and me, simply because we weren't educated enough, we didn't know that much about politics, so it shouldn't be left up to the common voter. And what they did is they put into place a system known as the Electoral College, and we hear about it all the time, especially in election years like this year. And they essentially, I can talk to you about the Electoral College, and I can go into details if you'd like me to. You can ask me about it sometime. It's fairly complicated. Maybe you remember it from civics of last year. I don't know. But that's the system they put in place. And that's the system that we still currently use today. It's kind of like having a popular vote, but it's not kind of like having a popular vote. So those were the three main issues: representation, slavery, and the election of the president. Now, what started to happen is that once we drew up the Constitution, there were two camps that started to emerge in trying to get the Constitution ratified or approved by the states. 9 of the 13 states had to approve the new Constitution for it to go into effect. And there was basically a campaign that went on. And the two camps that emerged were the Federalists. The Federalists were in favor of the new Constitution. It promoted a much more stronger central government. And the Federalist Papers were written by men like James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, were the three big Federalists who were in favor of the Constitution being ratified. And think of it as a large public relations campaign that was going on. And they wanted to see the Constitution ratified as quickly as possible. The other camp were the anti-Federalists. And they were very fearful of the new Constitution. They were very fearful of the fact that the new Constitution drew up and created a much stronger central government. They were thinking, why in the world did we just fight this revolution when the idea of the revolution was to break away, right, and declare independence away from a strong monarchy, a strong central imposing government, if all we're going to do is create another strong central government. So they were very much against it. They were also concerned about rights to the individual person. So in the end, the Anti-Federalists said, we'll approve and promote the new Constitution, but we also want a Bill of Rights to be drafted and added to the new Constitution before we okay it. Now, it's important to remember that the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were not political parties at this time. Okay, they were not political parties. They were essentially two groups of people that emerged because of the drafting of the new Constitution written in 1787. All right. Oh, what do you know? That brings us to our last slide. And what do you know? Another scene from Hamilton. So you're going to stop me. This will be it. I encourage you to watch this act from Hamilton known as Nonstop. It's going to kind of pick up there. It's going to be about that last slide I just showed you. And that ends the slides. So I'm going to stop here, and you're going to hear from me probably again, and hopefully you got a lot out of this. And I will talk to you soon. Bye for now.